So today what I'm going to be doing is going to be going through this Silent Hill 2 HD playthrough. Going through it and speculating and sort of hypothesizing how some of the things that we're seeing might have been programmed. So kind of like speculating on the nuts and bolts of it, what's going on underneath the hood. Maybe we'll get to some theory design. I might put my 2 cents on things. Hopefully this is an ongoing series where you guys can see that like not much changes between like no matter like Silent Hill or Mario Kart. It's like a lot of the design concepts are gonna be the same. By the way, full disclosure, never played Silent Hill 2. It's always really intrigued me. So there's gonna be a lot of spoilers in here for me and for probably other people watching. We're starting with the cutscene. And the first thing I'm noticing honestly is that it's pre-rendered. The way they're moving and the lighting and everything. Let's take this and we'll compare it later, right? So we'll have this on hand and we'll compare it to what we find later on. 5 minutes of opening stuff, huh? Okay, so this is starting to look closer to game graphics now. You guys can tell. You've got to be able to tell, right? Like who can't tell at this point, right? You look at these two things side by side. You can already see that there's like a bunch of post-processing stuff right now. Like just the way these edges are, like you can see that there's kind of like blooming and like a sort of blurriness. The image quality in general is not as crisp, right? When I zoom in on this one, you'll see that there's much sharper edges, like all along right here. Mirror stuff. All these are materials, right? You have this like grungy wall texture material. You have these like this tile material, right? You have the metal pipe material. This part, the mirror, there's some like overlay of it, like you can see the little rust and like the kind of like smudges and dirtiness of it that's like on top, but the actual reflectiveness of it, that's kind of a different thing. Where like, how are you going to render the same thing sort of twice? It was an old problem that wasn't easily solved in real time. For pre-rendered stuff, it was a little easier. It was still computationally really expensive to render the same image twice, but like on a thing. What you ended up doing back in the day was actually you would have a separate room. So like this is actually like a hole in the wall. And actually on the other side, you have like a full body of this guy. So his shoulder continues off here, right? And his body continues down here, and he has like feet down here or whatever. You can imagine him behind this wall. The controls would be inverted. So from above, it might look like your player's right here facing this way, and in the mirror, you have like another duplicate, right? So if your player moves this way, it sort of keeps those controls, but like inverted, and it makes your doppelganger, your little mirror guy, move that same way. So that was like a really common way to do reflections. Nowadays, we just have cool little probes that you throw in the scene, and it creates a material that actually can create reflections. Still computationally expensive. We don't put them everywhere in games. You'll still find modern games don't really commit to the full mirror thing, or they'll kind of do little weird things where like the mirror's foggy or kind of has like other screen space reflections. Like there's lots of tricks. So the fog in the scene that I'm seeing right now, you can't see it in a freeze frame, right? You can only see it as it's going by. But I imagine that what's happening, if you look at this scene right here, in a top-down view, this little wall he's standing by, and this car is like right here, and then the trees are back here. I think what might be happening is that like they have a plane or potentially like some type of particle system that's emitting images of fog across between you and the camera, right? So if the camera is like right here, if you see this as a plane of fog texture, and all it has to do is like slide across, right? And so here's the camera, and again, it could be particles, so it could be a bunch of little flat boards like this that each have a texture of fog on it, and they're all just kind of going this way. Or it could just be one giant plane that has, if it just sits right in front of the camera, and then you do like UV sliding. So like as long as the texture is like tileable, you can have a single plane and then be sliding this. But do you see this? When he moves to the left, the camera's moving exactly with him on the left. He more or less stays center of the screen. Did you see that? Like he's basically still center of the screen the whole time. But you'll see that the camera booms down. It's like craning down, right? See how it's getting lower to the floor there? And then here it just switches to another camera entirely. There's probably like checkpoints as the character's moving between like here and here. The game's probably only really reading it in terms of like how far left or right he is, right, on this axis. And the closer he gets this way, the closer he is to cutting to the camera. So it's like he probably has like a bounds. So this could either be a distance thing, right? Where they have a little thing that says like this is an actual, like in Unity, you might say that this right here is like a game object. The designers can hand place it there and say, when the player distance is less than like units, maybe they say like, 1.5 or something from this, then cut to the other camera, right? Then cut to the other view. But if it's greater than, you stay in this view right here in this camera. The other way that you could do it is by making colliders. So it could really just be that the player's like in this big box that looks probably like this, right? So the player's in this big box, and as soon as the player exits the box, it cuts to the other camera. So only when the player's in this box is it in this view that we're currently in. Again, it could be the distance one, it could be this collider, it could be the inversion of this collider thing. It could be that there's actually a box right here, and that when the player enters that's when it cuts to the other camera. The camera going up and down, booming up and down, could be more tied to this distance thing, right? Because then what you have is a number that you can tie to another number, which is like the player's distance and how high the camera is. And it's like the further away the player is from that spot, then the higher the camera goes. Or the closer the player is to that spot, the lower the camera goes, right? This specific generation of games will remain always an inspiration to the game dev industry. Absolutely. And even as somebody who didn't play a lot of these games, like I tried a handful of the Resident Evil games when I was younger and stuff, but they're still just really influential on like design tropes, both mechanical and like art assets and stuff like that. Absolutely. Super, super important in the history of game development. Check this out. This is kind of interesting too. I'm pretty sure this is all 3D. I imagine that this is all genuinely 3D models, because the alternative is that these are all images, that this is just one flat image, and it's like, it's literally this. It's literally like if I screenshotted this, and then in the game, there's an invisible box that represents the car that's like this, right? Because one game that I know did that for sure is Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. They had this kind of setup where it was like pre-rendered images. You get no parallaxing on, right? You can't look at it from different angles. And it's hard for me to tell right now because as the camera was moving around, I wasn't necessarily seeing any parallax. The car door right here, when the camera moves around it, it wasn't necessarily that like any more or less was revealed of it, right? Because like if I show you this water bottle, if I move it over here, you could see the barcode now, right? I'm not twisting the bottle. It's just at an angle to you now. But if I move it again this way, the barcode is obstructed, right? And that's not me doing this. I'm not twisting it. It's literally just its position relative to your like sort of center point of view or whatever. And so that's parallax, right? Parallax is when you can see different angles of things based off of your position relative to them. In this, when I'm watching this playback, I'm kind of like, I see some of that in the top view right here. I feel like I could see that door kind of moving down. But this one, it's hard to say because the original Resident Evil pre-rendered their backgrounds. So they got to make them look super pretty, have really nice lighting and stuff. A lot of old games did this. And then they just put in these invisible colliders. And the only thing that was actually 3D would be like the character model, right? Because the budget for the polygons would be so limited. They're like, well, if there's one thing that needs to be actual 3D and move around and more dynamic, then we'll just make it the player, right? And then they would just bump into these invisible boxes and stuff. And this fucking thing is definitely pre-rendered, right? Can you see the difference? Am I crazy here? Like, do you guys see this difference? This is definitely pre-rendered. You could see all these like little, like, let's fucking screenshot this shit. You could see all these little specular highlights on it, right? Like this right here. Look at all the edge right here. This little highlight in here. This could be baked in, but just generally based off of like how soft the edges get over here, they look more reminiscent of that opening scene, right? Like those opening screenshots that I took, remember how her edges were really soft? This kind of has a lot of that to it. Right here, the paper, where the paper is resting on the seat, you could see on the edge down here, wherever the source of light is, you could see these sort of what we'd call like contact shadows. So it's like there's a tiny little edge, you see this? Where it gets extra dark right here, where you don't see it over here. You kind of see it right here. You don't really see it right here. You can kind of start seeing little glimmers of it over here. That's something you would want to pre-render and fake, because contact shadows add a sort of level of fidelity and like realism to it. That's one of the giveaways. What do we have here? If I play this, the map like fades away. What's interesting here is like you could even see the shadows like fading with it. And it's like, it's not like the map moves, right? It's not like a hand goes in and grabs it. It's not like there's any dynamic aspect to it all. It just fades away, right? So that's kind of like another clue to like, okay, this is pre-rendered. Tired animation could be as simple as like, while the player is running, as soon as the player is running, it turns on a different system, a little separate system that makes a number start going down from 100 to 0. And as soon as it reaches some threshold, or maybe even all the way until 0, maybe it depletes really fast or something. If it ever reaches that, it says, hey, if you ever stop running, then play this animation instead of your normal animation when you're standing still. So you might have these two animations, one of just standing still, which we see right here, right? Versus the one where he's kind of like heaving, right? You see him like, he's like breathing. Super simple. Really easy way to kind of make your world feel alive. So as soon as like the camera hits this like branch, basically, the camera like goes, whoa, I better like turn around and face this other direction. See, we're kind of hitting this branch. He's about to like be obstructed. Camera like, and it zooms out too. It changes its focal length, and then it starts following him actually. That's interesting. It's not like following him one-to-one like if you were playing Mario, Gears of War, MGS, any of those kind of things. Is like the camera's like has a sort of locked relative position, and the character might have some wiggle room within this little like space, but this one looked almost as if it was on rails, right? If this is the path that the player is on, if this is the player, right, and they're going this way, the camera, if it wanted to, normally if it just stayed locked behind them, they would always be kind of like a little pair that's like they're the same every way. Like that's how it is in a lot of games, right? But it seems like in Silent Hill, the way it was going was that there might be these little nodes, there might be little checkpoints. So it's like one right here, one right here, one right here, here, here. And what the camera is doing is sort of like interpolating between them, right? It's sort of smoothly going from here to here. It's like a linear thing. So it just goes here, and then once it gets here, if the player keeps going towards this one, then it starts going to this one, and then this one. And so it ends up creating this really straight path that's more like And what that creates is like a really cinematic feel, right? Like that's not a super dynamic video gamey feel. Instead, that's closer to what we expect at a cinema, which is like a dolly track. We put a camera on like a dolly, it's like literally rails, like a little, you can imagine like a little train track or roller coaster, and it moves straight along them. Sometimes they're curved, but they're usually a very rigid sort of system. This is actually what it's really famous for, is the fog. This fog is very uniform, because fog in real life is sort of clumpy and noisy, and sort of like sometimes it's a little thicker around some areas, and it's like, because it's like particles, it's literally like our atmosphere that's changing, right? So it's not sort of homogeneous, it's not even. But in video games, a cheap way to do that is just to be like, well, generally we know that like the way we perceive fog is like how light travels through it. You might have you here, your vision is like that, you're looking that way, and the object you're looking at is here. Normally on a non-foggy day, you'd see it just fine, right? All the little photons that are supposed to be bouncing off of this and reaching your eyes, right? But when there is fog in between things, what you end up with is like a net or like a little spider web that catches the photons, right? So the more of this shit that it has to go through, the fewer photons reach your eyes. From a really far distance, you're gonna see even less because it has to go through even more fog. If the thing was like right here, you might be able to see it faintly, because at least some of the little photons would get through, right? But the further it goes this way, the more it has to get through all of this fog shit. What's cool is that in video games, the way you could fake that, the way you could fake the impression of fog, is literally just say, change the clarity of something based off of its distance, like just its distance alone. And I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that for sure, but like, look how it's like a linear fall off, right? It's like literally with each step he takes, as we get closer with each little, it literally just starts fading in, and it's very linear. It's very just the same. You'll see each row of gravestones come in at the same time. And that's just kind of like old school fog systems. There's also a lot of this particle fog. It's like pretty smoky, actually. There might have been technical innovations, but mostly I think Silent Hill 2, probably even at the time, was a technically like average game. I imagine. Maybe I might be wrong on that, because a lot of the things happening here seem to be solely based off of like design decisions. It's still just, oh, I picked up a map. Oh, I'm looking at an item, you know, and it's playing these cutscenes. Like we were doing this for a long time before Silent Hill, and now we're getting our first little moment of player action, right? Look at the head of the player. If I lower the speed down, facing this way, right? But as the player like moves to the side, the character model's still looking at the monster. You see this? See, he's like walking to the side, but he's still looking over here. Which I think that's pretty cool, right? Because that's like saying that the animations, like these sort of like baked animations, are being independent from like something that's more programmatic. When he swung this thing, that all that really happened was that he did a sphere cast in front of him. So when the moment he swings down, a little invisible sphere got created in front of the player, and it checked, is there anything inside the sphere? And if so, sort of do the deal damage system to it. That usually means just make a number go down, and then that's like a chain reaction. If the number is 0, then that means play a death animation and stuff, that kind of stuff. That's one way, is doing a little sphere cast, or even like a box cast. And it only pops up for a split second, right? Like he's coming up here, and then right when he swings it, it probably pops up for like 2 or 3 frames, and it just checks during that time. Even the monster itself, I imagine at the time could have been one single sort of like capsule collider kind of thing. Otherwise, you're putting a lot of little capsule colliders and a sphere collider for the head, right? So it's like that. And a lot of little capsule colliders for the arms, like 2 for the legs, right? And then like maybe a box collider for the body. Man, look, it's just like, this game really is, it's like, it rests on entirely just the mood of things, right? Mechanically, it seems to be very, very simple. You move around, you hit a couple things, you move around even more, you're running around, you're walking around, you collect something, you observe something. It's so just about like being in a space, right? What do we got here? Picking up a bottle, got a health drink, like interacting with like items and stuff. That means that there's like on each object, there's probably a variable in there for like what that text is, right? So like, he says, I got the apartment gate key. Probably on that key, you probably have several pieces of information. So it's like, it's probably the same thing for the bottle that they picked up. Object that the player can interact with was probably the model itself, right? So you have, let's just say model, the key, right? The little geometry of the key with the collider on it. If it was down here, if this was the key, there's a pretty good chance that it had like a collider on it to like represent like, oh, the player is at the key and now they can pick it up. And so it could have been like a sphere collider, right? Kind of like halfway sticking out through the ground. So as soon as like the player was in this sphere, then it gave the player the option to like pick up the key. When they do pick it up, for sure what was attached to it, or very likely, is this text right here. I got the apartment gate key, right? So it's like, you would call this something like, there might be a variable on that object, like a script called like pickup text. And so you have this little formula now of how all objects work in your game. Always gonna be the model that you can see it. There's always gonna be the collider that's like around it, like how big is the thing? So it's like, you have to be really close to it, like where is it exactly? And then you have the text that shows up at the bottom of the screen when you pick it up. You kind of have like an additional thing that I think might be something like a bool, right? Like a bool value, so that like this is just true or false, which is essentially just 0 or 1. These sort of 4 values are probably in every object in the game. And that last one, this bool thing, is about like when you get somewhere else in the game where you can use that item, it's like, hey, do you have this? Like, can we queue the next thing? So when you get to a door, it just says like, check if gate key is true or false. And if it's false, that means you never picked it up. But if gate key is true, then that means, yeah, you can open this door, right? Again, there's the text. I got a flashlight. Come on, pick up the fucking key. Okay, and she kicks it. So it looks like maybe this is controlled. Yeah, the player's definitely controlling it. It's probably with the analog sticks, right? So the question is like, do you make it so you have to rotate it? That's like a little harder than just saying hold it in left or right or up or down, right? Because what you have to translate is a rotational value. It could just be a number between like 1 and 360, 359 or whatever it is. So it's like, or 0 up there, 180 down here, and then like 359 right here. Because then essentially you're saying like you either have to move left or right or up or down, and then that should just increase or decrease this value, as opposed to if you want to make it so it's like you're actually winding the thing, is this controller being sort of wound in that direction. Holy shit, man. Yeah, it's crazy how much is just like running around. Okay, reading some notes. Classic horror game, just pick up a notebook and read some notes. Not much to it. I mean, all this shit, straight up, you could you could learn in my horror course. So in case you don't know, I have a horror course out. I mean, it's like it's a project-based course, so it's like we start totally from scratch. You could be a total beginner, and we go through making all these tropes of video games. So it's like making characters, making enemies, making a little spawner for the enemies, making fucking key codes, and picking up keys and lock doors, and little triggers to cue screams and sound effects and all sorts of stuff. But one of the things is notes. So classic one right there is just like pick up a thing and be able to read some text, right? Do some world building the old school way. So the way this works, pretty simple. I actually was just working on a game where the whole point of the game is basically escort missions. But essentially in games what you have is navigation meshes. In the whole world, there is, floor or ground, and somebody, I think back in the day it was more handmade, but I think eventually we got to a point where it was made a lot. There's a lot of systems that can make this programmatically, but essentially what you end up with, a sort of, if you can imagine like a cut up paper with lots of folds in it. It's like a flat thing. So it's a mesh. You can imagine this room that it might look like this. So you have this, and then this, and then here's the corner of this wall, right? It goes up right here. There's the door and all that stuff right there. And this probably comes out like this, right? So all of this is the floor, right? You build a mesh that is considered, here is the walking space. So this is considered a navigation mesh. We have this in Unity, you have it in Unreal, basically all modern game engines have some form of this. This is just the room, but if you take into account this desk, right, it cancels out this little area too. And it says, well, now, actually, the only places that you can walk in this room, let's even say this chair, right? This chair is kind of taking up space. So this spot is off limits. It would then use that as all this blue part is where you can walk. And it's only on this blue part that you can walk. These parts are off limits. So this guy, he's standing like right here, right? She would be considered like an agent, like a nav mesh agent, or at least that's what it's called in Unity. I think maybe in Unreal they call them actors or stuff or something like that. But essentially what you're saying, hey, what you need to do is navigate this huge mesh here to get to this point, right? So this is where the player is and you want to get there. And because it's an escort mission, because it's trying to like simulate a character, it's like, don't get all the way there, get like within a meter or two of him. So as long as she's like close enough, she'll like stop like right here. If he gets any further, then hey, go towards him again. And again, you only have this plane to navigate. The way you do that is by looking at this huge mesh right here, and this mesh actually, just like modeling things, is sort of like broken up into a bunch of different polygons. Something like this, right? It's a bunch of these different polygons, and where she's standing, it'll take like one of the closest points to wherever she is, and it'll say, okay, find the next point until you get there, and it'll go like this, and if he's standing all the way over here, it'll go like that, right? And so her path would end up looking something like this to get to the corner of the room. It's so funny because I'm just fucking realizing like I did all of this for the horror course. I've never played this game, but I know these tropes, and it's just so crazy because like so many other games after this, right? Yeah, in the horror course I also teach this. So this one, they give you like a full-on cursor, which is kind of funny, but this is definitely a pre-rendered image. There's not much to it. It's like each button you press, enters that value into like a string variable. And then when, if it's a 4-digit code, then by the time you hit the 4th digit, it says, okay, now it's time to check. And if it's correct, then it'll let you in. And if it's incorrect, it'll clear your last answer and then ask you to try again. Just soaking in the vibes.
There it all is.
And that's it. I guess the game ends on a huge wall of text for about 3:39. So for 5 minutes, you read all this text. This was like bare bones sort of dissection. This was a low bar, this episode. Silent Hill 2, I'm shocked at how minimal it is. I think it's really giving me a good understanding of like just how minimal of a game design you can go with while still having like a really strong impact, right? If you have any suggestions as to which games I should try to do next, just tweet me. Hit me up on Twitter. Tell me to dissect game X, Y, and Z, or leave me a comment in the YouTubers. All right, peace.